Hello. Hi everyone, my name is Alicia Homer and I'm the Executive Director at Metro Toronto Movement for Literacy, and I'm joined here with my colleague Kimberly Lansdowne. Thanks for having us. It's our first time doing a webinar, so if we're not able to notice all the bells and whistles, I hope you'll bear with us, and Sarah will pipe in and let us know if we haven't noticed your hands up and that sort of thing. We're excited to share with you an overview of our project from earlier this year, creating pathways of learning support for Employment Ontario clients and learners with learning disabilities. Many of you might already be aware of this project because we did a cross-province focus groups and interviews with key informants with providers and with learners and clients from across Ontario. So some of you might have been part of that. We learned a lot. It was a big project that was swished into about 9 months. It was a very intense experience. There's a lot of material that came out of it, so we're going to kind of be doing a skimming overview of the highlights of the project. And of course, afterwards, there are the full in-depth materials to share with you that Sarah will send you a link to. Just to clarify, this project did not develop any specific tools or new resources. The purpose of the project was to do a scan and pull together existing best practices and to act as a guiding post and direct you towards existing resources and connections that might be helpful to you in your practice. And I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, good morning everybody. It's nice to meet you online. I'm Kimberly, as Alicia has mentioned. What we'll cover today is here on the agenda, and it will be a very condensed version, and all the information that we've used in this presentation will be made available to you. Sarah will provide you with those resources so you can get a more in-depth understanding. I'll just note here, just for clarification, we often use the acronym LD when we're speaking to talk about learning disability or learning disabilities. So if that comes up at all on the slides or when we're speaking, you'll know that LD, we're meaning learning disabilities. So I'll hand it back to Alicia to get started with some of the background on the project.
Okay, so the project was a germ of an idea about 2 or 3 years ago in discussion with the partners and providers within the Metro Toronto Movement for Literacy network. We saw a gap in information and knowledge or access to resources and existing best practices. We were fortunate enough to have the support of MTCU to fund this project, and the goal was to do that survey, pull together all the information that we could find, consult with learners and practitioners, which was a really important part of the program. Just a little reminder from Sarah to slow down. It's definitely my grandmother used to always tell me I spoke too fast, so I apologize for that. I'll make sure I try to be conscious of slowing down a little bit. And Sarah, please remind me again if I start speeding away like a hamster. We conducted a detailed and comprehensive review of existing supports, interventions, and accommodations, collected current data on the numbers of clients and learners who are in need of services, and identified customized learning strategies geared to meet the specific needs of learners with learning disabilities. This sort of initiative, this project, has not been done before, so that was kind of our sales pitch to MTCU of why it was important to do this. In our kind of background preparation and preparing the proposal, we couldn't find anything similar to what we've done with this project, so it has a unique contribution to the field, and we've had a lot of positive feedback, and we hope that you'll find it useful as well. We worked with a strong advisory committee of individual experts, as well as our project partners, our funder, MTCU, Employment Ontario, Seneca College, George Brown College, Frontier College, and the Learning Disabilities Association of Toronto. And our researcher, Heather Lash, who is an instructor at George Brown, is an expert in the learning disabilities field.
So the outcomes or the deliverables of the project included, as you see here, a toolkit for practitioners. That's the blue one just here. I don't know if I'm pointing to it or not. Let's see. Oh, yeah, there we go. The blue one here is intended for practitioners. Over here, the orange document, that's the Learner's Toolkit, and that was intended for learners and clients who would self-identify as having a learning disability. There were also 2 research briefs, as well as an in-depth research report and an environmental scan. Again, all these documents will be made available to you. I see in the text chat Sarah's provided you with a link, I believe. Yes, there it is. I should mention that this toolkit in particular intended for practitioners, the one that's called Current Best Practices and Supportive Interventions for Learning and Clients with Disabilities. This one is not only intended for LBS instructors, it's with all social service and EO providers in mind. So do share it widely when you have access to it. And we look forward to presenting the material that is largely held in the Practitioner's Toolkit.
And just a note on the Practitioner's Toolkit as well, that is the one publication that we did print hard copies of. So if you would like to receive printed copies, please let us know.
Okay. So what I will talk about next is whoops, I think I've gone too far here. There we go. So we're going to just talk a minute about who exactly we're talking about when we're speaking of adults with learning disabilities. We know that people who struggle to learn are making up about 10% of the province's population, and that they're largely overrepresented in Employment Ontario programs. You may have experience with that yourself, and if you have experience with folks who have learning disabilities, you'll know that there's a lot of barriers that prevent participation in literacy and employment-related activities. We're seeing an increasing need for services that are targeted towards adult learners with learning disabilities, and we've got a lot of evidence which is indicating that their numbers are actually increasing in EO programs. So I've got this statistic from MTCU's College and University's year-end report. This is from 2007 and 2008, and they've actually indicated that the number of college students with learning disabilities has increased by 10.1% in the last 5 years. And it's interesting to note too that in the key informant interviews, one community college LBS program officer actually estimated that in the last 5 years for their program, their number of students with a learning disability has actually doubled. So, I mean, you'll know from your experience that these individuals are going to be struggling academically, they're going to have inconsistent participation in programs, and they don't always reach their educational or employment goals. So, you know, there's a significant challenge in serving these clients, and they're also, you know, faced with a number of personal challenges that we're hoping to provide support and speak to. So I'll just draw your attention here to some more statistics. Up in the red box at the top, we've learned that adult Canadians with learning disabilities comprise 30 to 70% of those incarcerated in correctional institutions, 25 to 40% of those on income supports, and as many as 15 to 30% of job training participants. You know, there's variation in the numbers, but it's certainly showing a trend towards this. In the blue box down here on your left side, you'll see that more than a quarter of Canadians with learning disabilities aged 22 to 29 did not complete high school. And that's twice the number of dropouts in the general population. That's a large number of young people who are not completing high school who have a learning disability. And over here on the right, you'll see in the green box that the average annual income of Canadians with a learning disability was $20,215 compared to the average of $26,640 for all disability types. So you can really see that folks with learning disabilities are coming up against challenges not only related to their learning and employment goals, but in terms of their earnings and their overall opportunities. So I do want to turn it over to Sarah to help me run a little poll so I can get a sense of what experience you have working with folks who have a learning disability, whether or not it's diagnosed or not. So they can have a formal diagnosis or a suspected diagnosis. So Sarah, I'll let you.
Thank you, Kimberly. So I see the votes coming in. If you haven't indicated what you think you are seeing in your agencies, would you indicate that now? All right, and now we will show you the results. Sorry, we don't have results from everyone. There's about 5 more of you to click on this. Could everyone vote, please? We've got most of you. All right, here we go. There are the results. Go ahead, Alicia.
Okay, thank you. So we're seeing that, wow, 46% of you are saying that 36 to 50% of your people you're working with have a learning disability, and actually 40% are indicating 50% or more. I mean, this is quite consistent with the research that we have been doing, so I'm not surprised to see that, but thank you very much for indicating your experience with that. I appreciate that. We'll talk a bit more about this later, and thanks for your input. I'll pass it back to Alicia here.
Okay, Alicia again. Before we move forward into the results of the project, we just wanted to touch on what do we mean when we say learning disabilities. We came across a number of proposed definitions for learning disabilities, and in North America there's only general agreement on what definitions should be accepted. Everyone agrees that learning disabilities have nothing to do with intelligence. For this project, we went along with the 2001 definition of learning disabilities that has promoted from the Learning Disabilities Association of Ontario. And what you see on your screen is that in detail. And just some highlights. I won't read out the whole thing, but it refers to a variety of disorders and resulting from impairment or processing related to learning, and the impacts of it. I mean, they range in severity, and they can interfere with the acquisition and use of skills, including oral language, reading, written language, mathematics. And learning disabilities can also cause difficulties with organizational skills, social perception, and social interaction. I think we often see those behaviors quite strongly in children who are frustrated when they've got undiagnosed learning disabilities or aren't getting the help they need. So it can have a severe impact on people's lives, both socially and the educational sphere. Following on definitions is the issue of labels. Labeling and labels play an important role in conversations around learning disability, but it's important always to focus on the individual, someone's individual strengths and challenges that can come from and play out in their unique situation. An LD is only one facet of a person's life, and we must remember that we're speaking of learners or clients. We're referring to the whole person, the body, spirit, heart, and mind. With many strengths, people who live in multiple contexts and whose identity and experiences are fluid within their social, constructs, independent communities, and the different factors that affect their life. Labels don't adequately capture the truth of a whole person, and they can be damaging. However, labels, if used by individuals and in collaboration with supportive educators and supportive communities, can be very useful. Labels can ensure access to supports, services, group memberships, medications, and accommodations. They open doors for people. There's a discourse around the term disability and whether or not it should be replaced with the term differences. But the Learning Disabilities Association of Ontario at this time chooses to use the term learning disability. It's a term recognized by the Canadian Human Rights Act, and it's the term used in medical, educational, and employment settings. We just have to make sure that people feel empowered and consulted in determining and using the labels they wish to use.
Okay. So, I mean, whether or not someone subscribes to the more formal learning disability term or label is an individual choice. I know some of you have mentioned there in the text chat that that you do need the label in order to get services. But I think it's helpful for people who are working with adults that might suspect they have a learning disability to be aware of some of these characteristics of a learning disability. You'll find in this in the toolkit we've mentioned a detailed list similar to the one on the screen. In many cases, it can be it can be very obvious that somebody has a learning disability or a challenge. And here's a few of the sort of key reasons that you might suspect someone has a learning disability. So the first one here on our list on your screen is the surprising discrepancy in actual performance. So you might find that someone is speaking very clearly, very articulate, but when it comes to writing down what they want to communicate, it lacks in clarity. In the second point here, you see performance can vary from day to day and even at certain times of day. So I've had this experience personally where I've helped somebody learn how to use an application on their phone, an app, and then they forget how to use it, but only in the afternoons. And you know, this isn't just a memory issue, this is happening at certain times of the day each time. In the third point here, you see the inability to concentrate for long periods. You might be easily distracted by noise or unable to reconnect to the task at hand. I mean, we're all often distracted, but this is more of a pervasive problem. In the fourth point down there, you'll see with problems with estimating time or distance. They might not be able to plan a multi-step project. They just have no sense of how long each step will take in order to reach that next step or complete a final goal. There is uneven memory. So that would be that someone wouldn't be remembering an instruction that you've given them earlier in the day or in your class setting. But they might have a fantastic memory for their favorite film or song lyric. So it's not that their memory is challenged, it's an uneven memory. You'll see there's also a difficulty with abstract ideas and relationships. So they might not behave what would deem appropriate for your class or workplace setting. They might have a difficulty picking up on social cues, or they just don't interpret your message in the way that you intended. And along with some of the memory issues, there's difficulty remembering order. So you might be leaving out important details in an assigned task because there's just too much information. You've been bombarded with the number of instructions. And at the same time, there's the difficulty in understanding cause and effect. So you might not realize that someone, if they're late every day for class or they don't attend meetings on time, that there might actually be some consequences and that you might actually be penalized for this behavior. So what I'd like to do next is I'll pass it over to Sarah to get your responses to this poll. And in this case, we're looking to find out how many individuals that you serve who actually have a formal diagnosis for a learning disability. So I'll let you go ahead and put your answers in, and I'll pass it to Sarah.
Thank you, Kimberly. And I see the answers coming in fairly quickly. Just give you a few more moments to all consider that in question, and looking for maybe just a couple more answers. I know Leslie has stepped out, but one or two more of you. Okay, thanks so much, and we will let you see this. I'm sorry, it looks like I just inadvertently took that away. I'm so sorry. All right. Can you give me a green check mark if you can see the results on your screen? If not, what I will do is send them. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, back to you, Alicia.
Sorry? It's okay. Okay. So we can go back to the next slide?
Mm-hmm.
All right, it's Alicia here. Our next section is screening, assessment, and formal diagnosis. Many EO clients and learners do not have a formal diagnosis and documentation, and as Summer, I think it was Summer who said, it's important to get that diagnosis and label in order to access services, which we definitely wanted to emphasize and affirm that's true. Despite the challenges, getting the learning disabilities label can be very important and can help individuals start to move beyond a lifetime of feeling, confused and frustrated about what's holding them back, and also being scarred by negative messages and experiences they've had in the education system, in their community, and in their home. Especially if other people in their lives act as if the indicators and markers of learning disability are signs of this individual being unmotivated, disorganized, unlucky, or lazy. Like we got a lot of feedback from the learners and clients that we spoke with about some painful experiences that they've had in their life. So getting a diagnosis can be intimidating and people can be reluctant to do so, but it can open doors for them and help them get access to the services they need. It has to be done. A formal diagnosis is called a psychoeducational assessment, and it must be done by a psychologist with training in learning disabilities. A high-quality assessment is very involved. It includes testing of short-term memory, reasoning, inference, testing of literacy skills, and comparing results of the two to discover how the former helps explain the findings of the latter, and then analyzing the results, because it's individual, clearly, to determine the person's cognitive strengths and weaknesses. Other related testing, depending on whether or not the person is an adult or still a child or youth, may be done by a pediatrician, psychiatrist, or neurologist. Just looking at the notes here. Yes, yeah, definitely. They're very individual. And I think that's why the formal diagnosis and testing and the assessments are expensive and lengthy and complicated, because it's very complex for individual to individual. Just looking at the comments on the side, as I mentioned before, this is my first time doing a webinar, so it's like there's a lot of stuff going on the screen. It's difficult to kind of keep up with it. Some barriers to formal diagnosis are financial. That's a huge barrier. The testing is very costly. There is a lack of services for assessment, lack of expertise, so there can be lengthy waiting lists, a lack of facilities, and compounded by the stigma still associated with learning disabilities, so people can be reluctant to come forward and say they want to be tested, or if they're being encouraged to do so by their educator or their provider, EO or learning provider, they may resist doing that because of the negative experiences they've had in the past. Starting a conversation around it. I'm not sure how many people around our webinar table here are, I think everyone is mostly learning and literacy practitioners, so I'm sure most, if not everyone, has had experience in this. Oh, thank you. Thanks for the affirmation. It's something that I'm sure everyone has had to deal with, is identifying or suspecting that one of your clients has needs in this area and a need for service and assessment. So it can be delicate, but if you make sure that we find ways to approach people in a respectful way, to encourage them to talk about this and provide awareness around the services and the supports available to them, because we can more effectively teach and support clients and learners when we're able to give them the supports that they need. So I won't go into, too many. I'm trying to kind of navigate that balance of like reading off every word on the screen and kind of summarizing what's on the screen. So what I'd really want to emphasize with this slide is the issue that getting a formal learning disability diagnosis is key to being granted deserved accommodations, which makes issues of access particularly important. And a lot of organizations have some knowledge, but not access to the services and the funding necessary to provide their clients with that. The duty to accommodate is a starting point. Addressing learning disabilities is already a part of the job of Employment Ontario service providers. We all have a duty to accommodate that is enshrined in statute and case law. The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act is a piece of legislation that obligates organizations to ensure their practices are accessible. Accommodation is the cornerstone of the right to equal treatment and opportunities, and it can involve changing the conditions of an environment, the requirements of educational assessments, in order to level the playing field so all people can just participate fully. The Human Rights Code explicitly names learning disabilities as a principle that guides accommodation. And these principles include inclusive design, full integration, individualization, and respect for the dignity of the individual. Okay, this is a little fun graphic from our toolkit. Despite the long-standing existence and enforceability of the AODA, awareness and comprehension of them and the resources to implement these guidelines and requirements can be limited across ES and LBS services, and indeed across all environments, employment, and community. Anecdotally, we heard lots of issues of challenges in integrating and setting up the accommodations that are needed because of lack of resources. The toolkit and this presentation will look at ways to help you tap into some of the resources to make it easier to integrate these things into your practice and to bridge that gap in some modest to large way, depending on what you're able to do, in order to better serve all our learners and clients. One thing we wanted to emphasize, and it came up in our research and in our conversations with learners and with practitioners, is most people and most institutions are aware of the legal requirements, but we want to have people shift their attitudes to go beyond the requirement to merely accommodate. The ideal is to encourage enthusiasm and full-hearted support for practices and supports in place that accommodate people and who have needs in this area. But again, as we mentioned before, there's the challenge of resources.
Okay, so I'm going to just step back a bit from the introduction and some of the basics that we're covering in this work, and we're going to just look briefly at some of the research findings that came out of this project. Again, the intensive research report and the research briefs are going to have all of the detailed information, but these were the four main topic areas that really came out in the research. So I'll just highlight each of these quickly in the interest of moving on to some of the more practical applications, and you're certainly welcome to read in more detail from the research report. So I guess I'll start by saying that the research for this project included a literature review, interviews with the key stakeholders, and many focus groups, some which you may have been part of, which is fantastic. And in every step of the way, the research was guided by these main questions. The first there on your screen being, what practices are best serving adults with learning disabilities throughout the province in all program streams? So we looked very closely at Anglophone, Deaf, Francophone, and Native learners for this work. We wanted to find out what approaches, environments, and interventions were the most supportive, and then what opportunities there were to share resources and coordinate efforts. And then, of course, after looking at some of these positive aspects, we really wanted to look closely in the second point there on your screen at where the gaps lied. What was the nature of the challenges that were really facing adults with learning disabilities seeking education, training, and employment? I notice on the side of my screen here a nice healthy comment section where people are mentioning some of the challenges they're facing in their work, and we were interested to hear that from service providers, and we wanted to hear about the challenges that learners and clients were facing in their everyday life. So we really needed to look in the final part of the question there what needed to be in place in order to address these challenges. The themes that emerged in the survey of the literature were these 5 themes that you see on your screen there. So there was the public culture and belief associated with learning disabilities, as well as one's own private culture and belief in terms of how they would understand learning disabilities for themselves. We found some information and theme on best interventions and supports, which we'll detail later to give you an opportunity to learn from these best practices. We certainly saw technology's increasing role as an important part of the supports available to people. And perhaps most interestingly was the way that concurrent concerns worked with learning disabilities to create, additional challenges for people. So what I'll do next is just have a little bit of a conversation about how culture and belief impact the way a learning disability is seen. So we know that that words are powerful in our culture, and we know that public beliefs have to do a lot with the language that we use. We've talked already about labels and how they can create access and how they can cause stigma all at the same time. We've even seen that the term learning disability is disputed within the community of people who have a learning disability. People that want to use a strength-based approach would perhaps highlight learning differences, and other people who, don't really want to medicalize a learning disability would not want to use this term either. The main issue in all of this conversation about language and labels is the social stigma that's attached to identifying with the learning disability. And because they're an invisible disability in many cases, people are often considered to be faking it or just making up an excuse for being lazy or slow. And this is based on a historical inaccuracy, where people are seen as not trying hard enough, and they just need to work harder to overcome some of these challenges that they have. And it is true that there are certain cultures and communities that place a higher value on academic ability. So their level of judgment, if someone is going to present with a learning disability, is higher, and it could lead to a very extreme stigmatization of that individual. And we know that you need to have a robust self-esteem if you're going to have a good sense of self-efficacy. So for an adult to go back into a learning program, self-esteem is just essential. I'm sure you've probably encountered this in your own work. If someone believes in themselves, they're going to move forward. If they're needing constant reinforcement and they're not feeling good about who they are, it's going to be more challenged just to learn some of the basics. Our culture is competitive and our resources are limited. So if we want to meet their needs, we really have to look at accommodating them and being sure that we do everything we can to support them. People are vulnerable for a number of reasons. The research, as I mentioned, pulled out these 4 main concurrent concerns. And again, the research paper will cover these in great depth. I feel I cannot do justice in the amount of time I have to just gloss over these 4 issues, which are, in many cases structural issues, in many cases social justice issues that we would want to spend a lot more time on. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to draw your attention to these concurrent concerns, highlight some of the main findings, and encourage you to read further in your own free time, let's say, if you have any. So I'll start with how learning disabilities and concurrent mental health issues go together, basically. So we actually found that the way concurrent mental health issues dovetail with learning disabilities is profoundly complicated. It's almost impossible to tell them apart. The causes and effects are just one and of the same, basically. I mean, if you think about it, if you have a struggle with processing information, especially anything related to social cues, you can become anxious, depressed, all of these things. So for example, if you're anxious or depressed, how can you learn effectively? How can you participate in a job interview with, and not be zoned out, basically? We also found very compelling research that showed that people who have an undiagnosed or unsupported learning disability often have poor mental health. I mean, mental health in and of itself, which compounded by poverty or poor nutrition habits, I mean, this is just all going to work together to exacerbate the risk of poverty. I mean, like I mentioned, there's a structural analysis that really suggests that these solutions are interlocked and complex, just as the problems are. One thing I really wanted to highlight, there's one particular statistic that just hasn't gone away. It's been in my mind since I read it. This is from some of the research. I'll read it to you here. For persons who committed suicide and left notes, 89% produced spelling patterns and handwriting errors that were similar to a school sample of adolescents with learning disabilities. I mean, 89%. That was a shocking number to me. And, just keep it in mind as you're investigating more on these concurrent issues. I'm going to move on to how the systemic issue of being racialized or poor. We know that as EO providers and LBS instructors, we're in contact with a very diverse community. And, it's pretty well understood that racialized people are more likely to be unemployed or underemployed in our society, which means they're often living in poverty. And they're earning 81.4 cents for every dollar that a Caucasian counterpart might be earning. So this is just, again, to highlight that compounded with a learning disability, these folks are just going to be facing significant challenges. And as I mentioned, this is really a social justice issue, and it needs to be looked at from a social justice perspective. And you'll find some voices and stories speaking to this issue, similar to the quote in the blue box on your screen, in the research report and throughout the toolkit, so that these folks have voices as well in our work. I'll pass it to Alicia here. Alicia.
Experience with violence and trauma, as Kimberly was saying about the kind of blurring and the enmeshedness of indicators of mental health issues and learning disabilities, it's also true of violence and trauma, indicators of violence and trauma. Violence impacts learning in profound and complex ways, and people develop strategies to cope and to fake it till you make it sort of thing in an outward way to survive trauma that they've experienced. This is true in the education setting and the employment setting, and also in our general lives. Survivors of violence often experience further trauma when they're in the school setting, especially if it's compounded with learning disabilities. And one thing that we found interesting in the research was, as I just mentioned, a lot of the strategies and triggers or indicators of experience with violence look identical in people who have learning disabilities. So fight or flight response, strategies to handle the gaps they have in learning, as well as strategies they have to cope in regular life, are very similar and often indistinguishable between people who have been experiencers of violence and trauma and those who have learning disabilities, and often people's experiences overlap.
So I'm not sure how many of you are working with learners or clients who are deaf, and I just want to mention that in our work we're celebrating deaf culture. So including deaf issues here in the concurrent concerns section is not to pathologize or make liability of deafness, recognizing it's a culture, but also that issues of learning disabilities are profoundly complex and understudied in this culture. So oftentimes linguistic and memory problems are often overlooked as a factor contributing to a person's learning difficulties, and this is just because they're just misattributed to communication challenges. And we're finding that providers that are qualified to do a necessary assessment are incredibly rare for the deaf community. And even if you have an assessment without expert interpretation, the results are not useful. You really need an expert who has a profound understanding of deaf culture in order to have a robust assessment that can be useful.
Okay, interventions and supports. Adults with learning disabilities, as I'm sure all of you are aware in your professional experience, resonate and respond to different instructional methods and have a variety of strategies that work best for them. There's no one-size-fits-all approach, which I think someone commented on as well in the side comments. Even for individuals that may share identical diagnoses or types of learning struggles, different individuals have different things that work best for them. However, there is recommended instructional methods and guides and approaches to creating learning environments that are consistent across the literature and in the research we did. We put a little smattering of some of the keywords that kind of resonate with the experience of interventions and supports and capture some of the things that we found. Directing you to the full-length research project and the toolkit, we identified a variety of websites, publications, experts in the field, and online resources and supports that I think you'll find very useful. A couple of examples are the Good Learning Anywhere website, the searchable online accommodation resource, Learning Disabilities Online, and LD Links collection of learning disability appropriate instruction guidelines. All of these things, there's a very comprehensive and detailed bibliography in the research paper, and also at the back of each toolkit we split the references section and there's a separate section of helpful resources, so you can kind of flip to that, and there's live links in the PDF copies throughout the documents as well as at the back. Then our next, and I think our final interactive poll is we're going to move on to discussing supportive technologies. So we wanted to find out, how familiar are you with various technologies used to support LD learners?
Thank you, Alicia. Just waiting for a few more responses from some of you. Looks like there is some familiarity in the group. And there you go. I think that's probably your final result there, Alicia.
Thank you. I'm going to pass it over to Kimberly.
Well, I'm glad to hear that many of you are somewhat familiar with the technology that's available. And we're finding that the technology is more widely available, especially things like e-readers and voice-to-text programs. But you might already know that this is a bit of a costly undertaking in many cases. So there is the financial barrier, but probably more important than taking care of the financial side is true buy-in from practitioners and from individuals in the learning context. Without buy-in, it's certainly not going to work. So I'll just give you, like we mentioned, you're quite familiar with some of these items here on your screen. So I'll just let you have a look there. When you look in the toolkit, you'll find that these types of assistive technology are covered in more detail, so I'll let you have a look at that. And we'll just move on in the interest of time to highlighting some of the voices that were captured in this project.
Okay, it's Alicia again. Ontario Voices. There's a section in both the toolkits called Ontario Voices, and as I mentioned earlier, in addition to surveying the literature and best practices in the text form, we also wanted to consult, and it was a big part of the project, face-to-face and over the phone with key informants and focus groups of clients, learners, and practitioners and providers. There's such a wealth of wisdom and experience in the sector, and we found it really gratifying and interesting, and we hope that any of you and all of you that were involved in that process found that as well. And thank you, just for the record, thank you so much for your participation in this. It really helped make the project the success that it is. There is I'll just kind of walk you through quickly through some of the kind of highlights of what we captured from our interviews and focus groups. First of all, what EO providers are saying about their experiences with clients and learners. It revealed a framework in which to consider EO structures and practices, both in terms of best practices and, as we all know, the extreme gaps and unmet needs that we struggle with. 4 major themes evolved from this conversation. The need for service coordination and development, a need for assessment and documentation, supportive technology and design, and strengthening of relationships. The next few slides, we've got some quotes that I'm not going to read out. We're going to, you're going to have a copy of this PowerPoint to take away with you. We just kind of pulled out some key quotes that we thought we wanted to highlight in our presentation here. I'll just kind of skim through some key points that came up in our conversations. A real appreciation for integration and a team-based approach was very evident in our conversations with providers. The importance of robust and accessible assessment mechanisms, and people highlighted the fundamental need for authentic relationships with clients and learners. And I would add to that, between clients and learners, and also the interconnected relationships between different kinds of providers as we all support our clients and learners between their learning pathways to their other goals and employment goals. Frustrations were voiced as well. Many people felt a lack of expertise and specialized training in the field of LD creates confusion in terms of intake, referrals, and advocacy. There's a disconnect among EO providers, was something that was said, a pressure to move clients and learners along the pathway and their goal pathways within certain pressurized timelines, and that makes it difficult to fully meet the needs that these clients present. And a lack of centralized coordination are things that all these things inhibit our full support for clients. I just noticed. Yes, indeed, I agree with Summer and Melody. The big elephant in the cyber room here is lack of funding resources to support a better infrastructure and our ability to meet these needs. Touching on the issue of disclosure and assessment, providers also noted that there's fear and reluctance among clients and learners to disclose learning disabilities, and we have a need to strategize to increase the likelihood of disclosure and find ways to communicate and support our clients and learners in that. And as you can probably tell, a lot of the things we're picking out are opportunities and potential for further work and project examination if we can get additional funding to do a phase 2 of this project, or funding from a different source to support additional work in this area. Moving on to learner and client voices. Again, I will leave these quotes for you to take a look at yourselves. Learners and clients, the concurrent issues that we've talked about earlier was a theme that resonated very strongly among most people, or if not all people who contributed their thoughts and voices to this process. People have complex relationships with anxiety, depression, self-medication, stigma, shame, embarrassment, and self-judgment, and the pain and agony that people have experienced of being singled out. All these issues were brought up again and again with the clients and learners we spoke with. And I just want to say it's a privilege for us to have people open up to us in this way, because these are very personal issues that people were discussing with us, and we're trying to honor that and be respectful of that. Another issue is the kind of experiences in childhood, and if you have a formal diagnosis, that kind of double-edged sword of diagnose and identify or not, the labeling issue, being put into the quote-unquote stupid class, being bullied and labeled, or if not having a formal diagnosis, getting those same stigmatizations, but without having the kind of clarity and understanding of, well, this is what I'm experiencing and having the supports you need. So it's always a back and forth on the issue of diagnosis or not. There's a lot of information stories from the learners and clients within. There's a short section in the toolkit and also an extensive section in the research paper that I encourage you to read. Deaf clients and learners, as Kimberly mentioned before, this is a unique stream that we wanted to meet with and discuss their specific issues. The focus group for deaf learners expressed a general lack of familiarity with formal assessment processes and an uncertainty about whether or not the issues they deal with are attributed to deaf culture or their experience of being deaf, or is it a literacy issue, or is it a learning disability issue? It's very complicated, and in our MTML had our network meeting last week, and one of the program managers from the Bob Rumball Center was there, and she, during our discussion around, you know, the literacy service planning and issues to bring forward to the ministry, all these complex issues come up as specific to the challenges of working with deaf learners, because they've got a lot of complexity and layered issues that also intersect with learning disabilities often. Aboriginal clients and learners, again, lots of concurrent issues that people deal with, which are overlapping and intersecting with learning disabilities. Culture, violence, historical context, socio-political context. It is a very, it's a maze of issues and complexity and history, especially in Canada. The legacy of a residential school system, rates of suicide, correctional issues, school dropouts, mental health, and stigmatization and prejudice are all things that make it very challenging for learners and clients from this sector. Yeah, I just noticed Summer's comment about history of interrupted post-education. Definitely, it is definitely a challenged sector and community, and people have a lot of negative experiences with the educational system. One thing that also that was pointed out or came across in the research was the cultural stereotypes that broader society has about Aboriginal people not learning in a linear, quote-unquote, linear way. So making assumptions about, oh, they learn that way, and shoving people into certain boxes or expectations of how we think they should behave or learn. And it's not true, and it creates distrust and obstructs an ability to look at all the options from all the angles that are available to everyone else. Let's see. And as I mentioned before, school remains a site of trauma for many from Native communities. Very complicated, but there's more in depth in the research paper and in the toolkit on that. I'll pass it back to Kimberly.
So just in the last couple minutes here, I want to tell you what we can do. I don't want you to leave feeling overwhelmed. I just want you to know that you're probably feeling compelled to rush out and take steps in your work to better serve learners and clients with learning disabilities. You might already be doing that, and I applaud you already. I don't want it to feel like extra work or burdensome work. What I would encourage you to do is have a look at the toolkit, because what we've got in there spelled out in detail are each of the following points you see on your screen. So some basic information on starting a dialogue with someone about access to assessments. We also have some very specific screening tools links to that in a questionnaire form that you could use organization-wide during your intake and assessment process. There's also a list of accommodation ideas to assist with all of the skills: reading, spelling, writing, math, all of those. And these are just covering some really basic ideas like how to make a clear language document, all the way to, providing someone a checklist to help them remember their tasks and their work. These are not high-tech solutions. Some of them are really basic. You may have been doing them for a while and forgotten about them. So, have a look back at this list of best practices and make sure you're still doing it in your work. There's also best practices for instructional methods, and these, as mentioned, a lot of these types of supports don't just support people with learning disabilities. They're going to help all of your students, all of the clients that you're working with. I'm just going to highlight that the Universal Design for Learning, you can see the 7 fundamental principles on your screen. These are, again, going to positively impact all of the people that you're working with. So you can have a closer look at that. Essentially, we want to acknowledge that there's no one way of learning any material or skill. And finally, I just want to remind you to trust yourself and your learners to know learners will know what's best for them and what they need to develop in terms of skills and how they can break old patterns. And working in collaboration with you, who, you very likely know what needs to be done. We've talked a little bit about the financial constraints, and it's easy to say that the financial constraints are the reasons why we can't make certain changes in our programs, but if we just step back and see what we can do, it's working towards a more positive outcome. If you need support, you should be reaching out for it. This is one way of getting support, looking at the resources we're providing. I know it can be challenging work, especially when we're talking about these concurrent issues, so don't forget to take good care of yourself as a provider. It can be really complex work, and you do need to support yourself. These materials that we've been discussing are there as a resource for you to improve your work. And to help improve the lives of the people that you're supporting. So, with these final thoughts in mind that you see on your screen, it's our hope that we can enhance self-confidence, lower the frustration levels, and allow people greater success in reaching their goals. In the long run, we're all going to benefit. I know you're all well-intentioned and you want the best for all of your learners, so do take a good close look at our resources and let us know if you have any questions. I'll pass it over to Alicia for one last thought.
Thanks, Kimberly. And I also want to thank Kimberly for putting together this beautiful PowerPoint. She did all the design and research work to distill this presentation, so that's very much appreciated. And we wanted to thank you all for coming and pass the floor to you to see if there are questions. I just see Stephanie asked a question about slides. Yes, Sarah will get those to you along with the resources from all the publications from the project. And there, I'm not sure how to moderate or navigate the question period, but tell us what to do.
No problem. I'd like to thank you, Alicia and Kimberly, for a wonderful presentation. I hope those of you who are still in attendance will join me in a round of applause for presenters who weren't used to this medium. You did a fantastic job, even for those who are used to it. I think that what you've presented here will really help secure greater interest in following up with your resources, and I reiterate that I will be sending those out along with the link to the evaluation for this webinar, which we would greatly appreciate you completing, and watch for that to come. Now I will stay to see if there are more questions or comments that you would like to pass on to Alicia or Kimberly, but we understand if you have to go, and this recording will be available to all of you who registered, and I will pass on the recording links as well. So if you have to go, you just click on the exit toward the upper right portion of your screen. Go ahead, Alicia.
I just wanted to also say a huge thank you to you, Sarah, as you guided us through this process and helped us set it up. I certainly felt a little bit intimidated about using this format and technology for the first time, and we thank you for hosting this and for your professional expertise. We really, really appreciate it. I'm sure all of us feel the same way.
Thank you for your kind words, Alicia. So I will stand by, and Alicia and Kimberly, you may also have to go. I'm not sure. I know you're extremely busy, and we appreciate your time. I can relay any late questions or the text chat to you, so you'll have it after in case there's follow-ups that you would like to make. So with that, I will wait and see if there are any more questions or comments. In this webinar environment, I can pass the microphone to any one of you who has a question or comment and has access to one, but we'll also watch the text chat. And Alicia, I don't know if you see Summer's question.
Yeah, I was just going to reply to that. Of course, we all know there's challenges with funding, but one thing we did find, it's in the toolkit on page 25. The Literacy Coalition of New Brunswick has a resource manual called Adult Literacy and Learning Disabilities, Best Practices for Success. And there's further information on screening and assessment, as well as information on funding for assessment for post-secondary students in particular. So if you go to page 25 of the practitioner toolkit, you'll find reference to that Literacy Coalition of New Brunswick's manual that has, I'm hoping, some useful tips on where to find some non-traditional funding for you.
If there are no more questions or comments, I will stop the recording. I'll just ask if you would click on the raised hand icon if there's anybody who would like us to wait any longer for questions or comments. Otherwise, we will end this session, and thank you all for giving time on a Friday morning in this busy fall period. And I also encourage you to watch for our upcoming webinars. The Community of Practice will continue with webinars in the same time frame. It'll be Friday mornings from 10 to 11 a.m. And our next one is coming up on Friday, November the 6th, presented by Andrea Dickinson from Tri-County Literacy Network on using video in marketing your programming. Okay, Alicia and Kimberly, I'm going to stop the recording now. And